hugely important one. You know, it's been disappointing to me, I must say, how the trade union leadership has effectively, in the name of depoliticizing the trade union, have actually been terrible on this issue. Absolutely terrible. And how, and you know, it really is a repeat of when Blair effectively took over the Labour Party, where the trade unions were saying, oh, but we've got to stay with the Labour Party because they're our party, when, you know, this is a man that won't allow his shadow cabinet or his MPs to appear on picket lines with striking workers in industry where they're experiencing the most appalling circumstances. And he's demoting people, they're losing the whip, simply if they appear on picket lines, which is an absurdity. It really, really is. And I agree with you, I'm very worried about the trade union leadership in the sense that surely its primary responsibility is to stand up for workers.
Yes, the Labour Party.
And if those are at odds with whichever political parties and politicians, they're the ones who should be calling out those differences and calling out those political leaders, because the trade unions, through their membership and of course through their income, have enormous, enormous power. I mean, their ability to impact the economy in this country is huge. But what it makes me think of is the fact that, you know, I think it's really important for people to be members of their unions, because otherwise how do you fight collectively in an economy that is so skewed towards the extremely wealthy, towards big corporations who really face no meaningful regulation, who face no meaningful checks and balances. I mean, I don't know about you, but I've just got my energy account for the last month. Yeah. And yet again, you know, we had all those incredible increases, and then they went down a tiny bit, I mean a fraction of what they'd been increased. Now mine's shot up again. My bill for the last month is 4 times the bill for the month before. And there's nothing you can do about it, because the regulator says that's great. The energy companies can basically charge us whatever they want. Now, the same energy company that provides my power, EDF, is actually owned by the French government. And in France, they're not allowed to increase by more than 4% a year. Here it seems as though if they're not increasing by about 4% a minute, they're not happy. Now, I don't know what is going on in this country. I have never seen such daylight robbery going so unpunished. And it's ordinary people who suffer the consequences. And our politicians all think it's fine, regardless of which party they're from. So I think it's not just about being a member of a union, it's about being an active member of the union, just like it is about being a citizen. You know, there's this notion of active citizenship. And it's not active citizenship to turn up at an election every 4 or 5 years when those in power deign to give us the right to vote, if you have no real choice when you're voting.
Thank you.
There's no point. We've got to be active citizens every single day. And we've got to start saying to those who want our votes, well, you're not going to get them as long as you continue to enable a genocide in Gaza, as long as you support and profit from, whether it's you personally or your political party, from the companies that are actually producing the weaponry that is being used to commit that genocide. Because if something happens in the world and the international rule of law miraculously returns, Britain, the United States, Germany, France, etc., are all going to be complicit with genocide. And the people who have been directly involved should face the legal consequences for that. So active union membership, active citizenship. Then what Nazir would say, I think, is so, so true. I would go further than just saying ignore Labour and Tory. I think you've got to be very careful as to who is standing in your constituency. If they're saying things that you feel comfortable with. So if the individual is saying, and has said publicly, since the 7th of October, there must be an immediate ceasefire. If they're saying the right sort of thing about the fact that there seems to be a very small number of people in this country who are enriching themselves in an extreme way, so that we've landed with a situation where we have more billionaires than we've ever had in this country's history, but we also have more people using food banks than at any time since the end of the Second World War. And if candidates aren't prepared to speak out about that and talk about how they personally and their party will change that to the benefit of the vast majority of people in this country, then I don't think you should vote for them either. So, you know, the reality is on some of the issues that I've been dealing with, there are some Greens who are really good on some of these issues, but there are some of them who are bloody awful. I mean, the current co-leader of the Green Party was right at the forefront of calling Jeremy Corbyn an anti-Semite. And he still hasn't retracted that. And, you know, he did this whole thing praising a horrible little book that David Baddiel, the comedian, who now suddenly has decided he's an intellectual, wrote about how Jews are ignored. And you can say anything about Jews and it doesn't matter. I mean, where he gets this from his own lived experience, I have no idea. So I think you've got to look at who is standing in your particular constituency for each of the parties. You've got to get together as communities, and we're creating something called the For the Many Network, which is an initiative that's really been led by Ken Loach, some trade unionists and some others, to create what we call community hubs in our areas that is just an opportunity for people who are generally progressive in the very broadest sense of the word, regardless of which parties they belong to, which organizations they belong to, or if they don't belong to any, to get together informally and to figure out what they as a community want to do, both come the election. So,
is this like People's Assembly?
Quite similar. And we're working very closely with the People's Assembly. Quite similar. And to say, well, if we've got nobody decent standing for any of the parties, let's find someone locally to stand as an independent, so that the issues that are of concern to many of us in every part of this country do actually have a voice in the election. And then, if, as is very likely, my own MP is our next Prime Minister, and we realize, not in months after the election, but in days after the election, that it's business as usual, and nothing's going to change, and some things might even get worse, that we can get together through these informal networks, and we can decide what we do as a movement to change the structure and nature of our politics in this country, which are broken, and which, yes, are working very well for what David Graeber called the 1%. But for the other 99% of us, I don't know about you, but I'm not convinced that this political system is working that great for me. And so that's what I would suggest in terms of how we go forward politically. In terms of the media, Paul, you're exactly right. I mean, this is a huge situation. And, you know, the stupidity of so many people where they just absorb some of the nonsense that is being fed to them. Like, you know, when Israel can't defend itself, or when defenders of Israel find they can't actually defend Israel because they have no evidence and no words or language to do that. You know, as is always, and I can't remember who said this statement, but as is always the first resort of the idiot, they immediately label you racist, anti-Semitic. You know, I'm a self-hating Jew. I mean, ask my kids. Self-hating is the least of my problems. They'd suggest exactly the opposite is the problem. But you know, this sort of nonsense pop psychology, because they actually don't have any means with which to defend what they're trying to defend, be it the political system here, the political leadership here, or the way in which our countries that are supposedly committed to the post-World War II international rule of law, allowing Israel act as a genocidalist state. If we feel that that is happening, a big reason for that is because our media has become so dumbed down. If you look at the best writers in The Guardian, which is supposed to be the centre-left newspaper in this country, you know, they were all pushed out. All of the people I worked with when I first came to this country, and we did some incredible investigations together on the way in which the arms trade funded British politics. Some of you might have heard of the Al Yamamah arms deal, in which only £6 billion of bribes were paid. It was The Guardian that did that story, and they investigated it for years and years and years. Now they don't investigate anything for 2 minutes. And, you know, it's mainly about lifestyle and culture, because that's what advertisers want. And the politics part of it, you know, they have an occasional article in so that it still appears slightly left, but most of the politics have this sort of unwritten subscript that is actually politically terrifying. And we've seen that since the 7th of October in the most blatant way. And I think the sorts of places that you need to look, and I'm very happy to send this to the organizers who can then circulate it to everyone so you have this. Double Down News. Brilliant. Owen Jones. Some people have some criticisms of Owen, but I'm telling you, he's one of the smartest people I've come across. And he will deal with one issue, like Israel and Gaza, which he has been extraordinary on. And he will put it in the context of British politics quite brilliantly, in a way that I could never do. Navara Media is another one. Some people don't like their style. I quite like it. But their content is really, really good. Al Jazeera was mentioned. They still do quite good investigations, and their news at least has some balance in it. I mean, it's not that the Qatari government doesn't have influence, but at least there is some balance in it. Then Middle East Eye, I would also recommend, is quite good. And as I said, Declassified UK. Those are ones that I would suggest. Yeah.
I would say not the Andrew Marsh show is also
Oh,
really
absolutely.
good.
Crispin, or not the Andrew Marsh show, is also brilliant.
Very good
The
interview.
Intercept.
And The Intercept.
Naomi
on
Klein
the
and
US.
Jeremy Scarhill.
Also,
The Intercept on American.
Goods News Network.
Good news.
Goods News Network.
Yep.
QAnon.
And the Morning Star.
And the Morning Star.
Of course the one is
Now that they have a sports journalist, the Morning Star is readable. Electronic Intifada, I'm sure. Are there any others? These are all great examples. So there's an enormous amount of alternative media out there. We've just got to take the time, we've got to find it online. This is the brilliance of the internet. Yes, I mean, there is so much nonsense there. You've always got to look at sourcing and verification of their information. I write books that on average have 3,000 footnotes, because it's the only way you can write a book about the arms trade, about politics, without landing up in jail. You've got to apply that same degree of verification to whatever you are reading. Ask yourself, who is saying this? Does it make sense? What are their sources? But there are, as we've just heard here, there are so many great outlets that we should all be utilizing. And then finally, to come to Kis' question, I'm going to be very quick. We can talk at length afterwards about Israel and South Africa, etc., etc. The thing that I want to say about the history of apartheid and Israel, the Namibian genocide, because we should never forget what is today Namibia was a colony of Germany, known as German Southwest Africa, was then incorporated into South Africa under apartheid and then became an independent country under the leadership of SWAPO, which was an ally of the ANC. But there have actually been a number of genocides in Namibia that have been committed primarily by Germany. There is one fundamental difference that's incredibly important between Israeli apartheid and South African apartheid. There are many differences, but there is one that is fundamental. There are many similarities as well. But the most fundamental difference is that apartheid South Africa was entirely dependent on the 83% of people in our country who were called, and excuse this nomenclature, but were described as non-white, for our workforce. South Africa's economy is built on natural resources, but us white or pink South Africans didn't want to be the ones to have to go down the mines because it's really horrible work. We didn't want to be the ones to have to mine out the diamonds. So what did we do? We got people who the founder of apartheid, Hendrik Verwoerd, who I discovered recently terrifyingly went to the same school as me, fortunately many, many decades before me, he described them as fit only to hew water and chop wood. But the South African economy was entirely dependent on that workforce. So South African apartheid could never be as brutal as the apartheid we have seen perpetrated by Israel, because South Africa was so dependent on that workforce. So we had to keep them enslaved, we had to keep them with the cheapest imaginable wages so that our corporations and politicians could maximize their profits, but we couldn't exterminate them. We have seen since the 7th of October how Israel is not in that position. Of course, There are some Palestinians who do work in Israel, some of whom live in Israel, some of whom have to travel through those horrific dehumanizing checkpoints. But the Israeli economy is in no way dependent on that workforce.
Why are they bringing Chinese and Indians in now then?
Well, they've been bringing migrant workers in forever. I mean, I was astonished at how many Bangladeshis there are working in Israel. I never realized that. So they get jobs they don't want to do. They get other groups in to do them because they know they don't want to rely on the Palestinians. Because it creates all sorts of intelligence problems for them in their eyes. So it's incredibly important that we understand that difference, because the bloodbath that we are seeing in Gaza today would not happen if those economic conditions were the same, in my opinion.
So there were a couple more hands up. Sorry, Kit.
Just as a follow-up.
So a follow-up.
Yeah, follow-up. I also mentioned the Nazi genocide, which you didn't actually touch on, how that fits into the picture.
The Nazi genocide.
Yeah,
Okay.
but the real genocide, the one that all others failed.
I thought that
I've
was,
spoken quite a lot about that.
to be honest,
That's
that
quite
was
amazing.
covered in the
Sorry, can I
talk.
just say something? That was actually quite extensive. What do you mean the real genocide?
Don't feed the troll, mate.
Yeah, okay.
He doesn't need the fucking out.
So my grandparents,
Yeah.
my wife's
Genocide,
grandparents,
genocide.
they were kicked out of their properties in South Africa because of race. The Herero genocide happened because of race. The Holocaust of the Jews happened because of race.
Yep.
Palestinians are being killed because of their race. You cannot see it as a racist issue. You need to read up history. It was race. Our grandparents lost everything because of their race in South Africa.
Yes.
Can I take, sorry, my mind's gone blank. Remind me of your name. I'll apologise, Molly.
John Toomey, I'm a
Yeah,
member
John.
of Unison, an active member of Unison.
Yeah, and actually, while we're thinking about that, I'll take one more and then, sorry, you were, yeah.
Expelled from the Labour
Tell me
Party
your
2
name
years
as well,
ago.
even though I know it really well.
Alex Blair.
I'm tired of it.
Uh, I think what I'd like to ask you about, if I may, Andrew, is
Do you mind if I read out the statement before you ask your question?
it's
It's
not
relevant.
my statement, is it?
Sorry? It was a statement from the TUC which we should have heard yesterday and in Cathedral Square, but Hazel was ill. So I'm only going to take 2 paragraphs from it, and it's relevant to an earlier question we had and the question you might be going to ask. On behalf of Peterborough Trades Union Council, I send solidarity greetings to everybody calling for a ceasefire in order to protect civilians in Gaza, also to the medical teams on the ground. We call for an end to the blockade of Gaza and condemn attempts by the British government to make boycotts of Israeli goods illegal. The international offices of our national unions often undertake campaigns for equality for Palestine and pass motions of solidarity at our conferences. So if you aren't a trade unionist, then join one and take advantage of the opportunity to fight for anti-racism, equality and respect for all. And if you do have criticisms of your unions, make sure you take it to them and make them work on it so that so I'm sorry to interrupt with that, but we should have heard that yesterday at our other event, and it contributes to the conversation now. So John, would you like to continue with your question?
Andrew, earlier you referred to Nelson Mandela as your boss.
Yeah.
But there's one other boss that you're familiar with as well, I think. That's the Bureau of State Security in apartheid South Africa. The point I'd like to make is that I think what we're going to be seeing now makes the Bureau of State Security in apartheid South Africa like a little toddler by comparison. I don't think we've even seen what the Israeli government is going to be doing in terms of the media and so on, and in terms of the way it's, our parties have been infiltrated, our unions have, and so on, and there is massive influence being exerted to keep people silent. And so, not a question, but a plea to people, let's not see this campaign end up the way we saw the Black Lives Matter campaign, which was fading and fading and fading, completely unnecessarily, we need to constantly reiterate what we're saying over and over again. We need to actually amplify it, because there are so many people out there who really are taken in by their local media, by the national media and so on, and they're not getting to the truth. And I think we've got a responsibility to get the truth out there. That's it, stop.
Alex, and then we've got Imtiaz, and then maybe we'll call that. You wanted to come back as well?
Me, just very briefly, just joining in with what you said as well. Comrades of mine have been arrested in London at the national demonstrations. The first time was due to a book, which is a compilation of Lakar articles written about Zionism, etc., and the history of it. And on the front cover, we have a swastika, a Star of David intertwined with a swastika, which rabbis that I've seen on the march have said it's absolutely fine. So those comrades were arrested. But last Saturday, comrades were arrested again, this time under anti-terrorism charges for our leaflet. I've got a copy here that you can have a look. Our lawyers say there's now in there, maybe mentioning the Al-Aqsa flood was not the right thing to do. However, how can you talk about it without mentioning it? So I will leave you a copy of it. And then one of my other comrades, who's an NHS consultant doctor, was arrested again under anti-terrorism charges. His children, he had his little baby boy there, was just left there. They were outside a police station, I believe in Hammersmith. They were outside there, his little kid, 4-year-old kid, wondered where his dad was. So now they've decided to get social services involved. And by the way, every single one of these comrades of mine, and I think there's 8 of them, that have been arrested, they had dawn raids, like 3 a.m. raids on their houses. They also, last lot was 6 p.m. apparently, just to fox them. But they were a little bit Mr. Bean rather than, or Clouseau rather than, I don't know, DCI banks, because they're sort of taking printers because they want to know where we print the stuff from, and they're leaving computers, and they don't care about our anti-capitalist stuff. They just really for the anti-Zionist stuff. Sorry for having a second bite, but just to let you know.
Thank you, that's really valuable.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And it kind of leads on as well. I mean, I think I won't be the only person in the room that found Andrew's approach and language used really refreshing. A lot of us in here will have got into conversations, whether it be with right-wing fundamental Christians in town, whether it be with Zionists online, and there's also other people in the room I know that have been at the bad end of the weaponisation of anti-Semitism as well, which is something that has affected a lot of the way that people speak about things in the UK. What I noticed about yourself in your speech, and it was, I think, right up until the last 5 minutes before we heard the word Zionist from yourself, Andrew. Whereas I know, certainly for myself, it's the other way around. Now, obviously, that's a little bit different being a non-Jewish person speaking about something which is so easily conflated by Israel and its supporters. But I just really wondered if you could maybe give us, as slightly less experienced and non-Jews, a little bit of insight and information as we are all trying to navigate these language issues. Thank you.
And Imtiaz, that was the last.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Andrew. My question is based around, I guess, my understanding of the situation over many years and what I thought was a meaningful solution to the ongoing plight of the Palestinians was always a two-state solution.
Imtiaz, could you speak up a bit? Sorry.
We know you can shout, we've heard.
No, I'm all right, I'll just crank it up a little bit. So, throughout my time, my history, just involvement with Palestine Solidarity and just awareness of the plight of the Palestinians, I always thought the road to a solution was a two-state solution. I can understand why people have issues with from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I was always of the impression that you can't go to pre-48, you have to go pre-67, you have to go 67 borders. But right now, especially given what I've seen, does it make me anti-Semitic to say, actually, Israel doesn't have a right to exist? Actually, there needs to be one state, there needs to be a one-state solution, because we know throughout history, Jewish people have always been made to feel safe under Islamic law, in Islamic lands, and they've been suffering from a Holocaust in European lands, and this is a European settler colonialist project in the Middle East, which should absolutely be disbanded, and we should welcome Jewish people to live under an Islamic state that is Palestine. That's my view.
Those are all great points and all questions. I mean, how does the Nazi genocide fit into this? I am going to actually take that question just to make one or two very quick points. For me, why I started where I did is the notion of never again. Because if you think about the Nazi genocide, let's always remember that 12 million people were killed by the Nazis. Yeah. So in addition
6
to 6
million
million Jews,
Listen to the man and learn something, for fuck's sake.
there were another 6 million
I'm glad you said it.
who constituted people who the Nazis decided were a threat because of their politics, either socialists or communists who had to wear a red star.
Gypsies.
There were then travelers, Roma people, who were seen as subhuman, because remember, at the end of the day, this is ultimately all about white supremacy. And that's something that does actually lead through the genocides we've spoken about, be it Namibia, be it what happened in South Africa, be it Israel today, and of course going back to Nazi Germany, is this notion of white supremacy. Because how else do you justify the fact that after the tragic killing of 1,300 people in Israel, I think all of whom were Jewish, you actually think it's fine and it's a process of legitimate self-defense for there to be, where are we at today? And I feel disgusting even having to say this, but 25,
like 30,000.
25, 30,000 people. No, that's fine because of what happened on the 7th of October. The only way in which you can come to that conclusion is if you believe that an Israeli Jewish life is somehow superior to the life of a Palestinian person who might be Muslim, Christian, a person of no faith, etc., etc. And unfortunately, that is the basis of the white supremacy that led to the Holocaust in Germany. Even though most Jews were white, they were seen as swarthy, which was a very, very particular viewpoint that Hitler had from a very young age, when he was a failed art student in Vienna. If only the art college had accepted him. It was this notion of you were swarthy, you were darker, you were suspicious, you did things that we weren't sure about. You had this ability to control. I had an instance where I landed up giving a talk in Northampton that I only discovered sort of during the talk, landed up being a UKIP discussion group. And while I'm talking about the global arms trade to Tony Blair, an elderly gentleman shouts out at the back, "But it's the Jews, it's all the Jews." And I was trying to figure out what that had to do with what I was saying. So I stopped and I said, "I'm sorry, sir, but how is this all about the Jews?" And he said, "The Jews control everything. If the Queen," she was still alive then, "wants to visit the Bank of England, she has to go to Switzerland to get the key from Baron Rothschild." So, the thought that the Queen actually turns the key and walks in and throws banknotes in her arm to look at all the pictures of her is in itself quite simplistic. But, and then as I was answering him, some other young guy shouted, no, it's not the Jews, it's the Muslims. The Muslims control everything. And he started showing around to the sort of 120 odd people who were there a photo that purported to show Jeremy Corbyn fighting with Hamas, and he actually said to me, "This is why Jeremy Corbyn is never in the country every weekend, because he's fighting with Hamas." Now the body was, quite a well-built chap with a submachine gun, and then Jeremy's head stuck on top of it. And I actually took the guy's camera and I said to everyone, "Have any of you actually ever seen Jeremy Corbyn? Do you know how old he is? Do you think this is his body?" And I said to the guy, so all those weekends, because I live about 10 minutes away from Jeremy, all those weekends where I bumped into him in London, was that his double? Or his swat crazy brother? The sort of madness of this, and in the end I had to really disappoint them, because I had to say to them, "Look, people, I'm Jewish, my wife is Muslim, Our first child, who was born when I was still in Parliament, was described by South Africa's leading political paper as the country's first Muslim. Okay. So we're Jewish and Muslim, and believe me, we control nothing. And you know, I made fun of it to try and make the far deeper point that these notions of a small group of people controlling everything, however you identify them, the stupidity of it, you know, those in power, and it's an intersection of political and economic power. We don't need some elaborate conspiracy theory to explain how they got into power and how they remain in power. They know instinctively how to retain power because they are brought up and educated to retain that power. And the main way in which they do it, I'm sorry to be economically reductionist, is by ensuring that we live in a state of permanent austerity for everybody except their mates, who I'm sure it's just coincidental all happen to be billionaires. Okay, so, you know, this sort of conspiratorial nonsense, but there's an important point there. And this really comes into the point that started with John and ran through all of the questions. And I'm sorry if anyone's offended by this. And if I land up in jail for this, then hopefully some of you will come and speak on my behalf. But there is such a thing as an Israel lobby. Just as there is such a thing as a Saudi lobby, and a Qatari lobby, and a European lobby. You know, the people who coined the phrase were two incredibly influential Jewish Harvard academics. And for 15 to 18 years, everybody thought their work was a great piece of scholarship. Until what happened? Until Israel, having been so close to apartheid South Africa, learning the lesson of how influential BDS was in bringing an end to apartheid in South Africa, created something called the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. And a number of ministers who served in that ministry have publicly acknowledged this, that the purpose of that ministry was to ensure that BDS against Israel went nowhere. And the technique and tactic to do that was to label all and any criticism of Israel, of its lobbying activities around the world, as anti-Semitic. And again, people, you don't need to be an investigative researcher like me to know this. Why? Because they've told us this. And we can find it. We can actually see the talks by the various ministers and the equivalent of the permanent secretary who first ran that department. This is not news. This is the reality. So when people try and talk about the Israel lobby, they're trying to stop us reflecting on the reality of global politics at the moment. You know, I work on the global arms trade. I'm as critical of Saudi Arabia as I am of Israel. Unfortunately, it's also a murderous and incredibly corrupt, very authoritarian regime that has been doing what Israel's been doing in Gaza, in Yemen, but in a less intense way over 8.5 years. I'm currently writing a book about Yemen and Gaza and the death of the international rule of law. Now, am I not allowed to talk about the Saudi lobby either?
Of course you are. Zionism again.
I mean, it's a nonsense.
Zionism.
So, you know, we have to talk about these things. I really enjoyed the other day when Benjamin Netanyahu used the phrase, from the river to the sea, all the land must be Israel.
Yeah.
And then Joe Biden's spokesperson, who at least has a bit more life in him than Joe Biden, was asked about it and whether this too is anti-Semitic. And, you know, our politics have become so intellectually vacant and vacuous that rather than try and respond to the question because he has no response, he says, I'd rather not comment on that. So it's not just the words. If you're on the right side of politics, in other words, the far right, you can use whatever bloody words you want to. It's only if you believe that all humans are equal, that things like justice, equality, and fairness, and peace are quite good ideas. Then you've got to be incredibly careful in the words that you choose. And because of that, while, and I'm going to sound a bit contradictory here, but think about the words that you use, and that's why I appreciate your question so much. I have no problem with people using the word Zionist. There are instances where people have used Zionist to mean Jew. That's the only problem I have. So that's why I don't use it very much, because it has been misused in some instances. That isn't a reason why we shouldn't use it. Be sure that you're aware of what you mean when you use it, as you are with any word or any phrase that you use.
Andrew, I would like to add into that actually, because December 2016, I visited the Holy Lands of Jerusalem and city of Nazareth myself, and I met with a lot of our, in fact, I would use the term which I used there as well within my interview. I was asked why I was there on the Allenby border to go into the occupied lands, and during the conversation, my social media, everything was brought out and asked why you said these things, and I gave all the answers possible. And the term I used to them, I said, listen, this land of Jerusalem is holiest to all the Abrahamic faiths. The ones who believe in Moses as the prophet of God are the follower of Judaism, and the ones who believe, well, I'm not going to go into the detail about Jesus, because for some he is son of God, but for us Muslims he is prophet of God.
But the interesting thing is, you and me are both Semitic people.
Yeah.
So even the word Semitic is completely
And that's something that needs to be really pushed out there. What Semitism means.
Blood traces and the DNA tests have showed that the majority of those who are occupying the land and trying to say that that probably Andrew is anti-Semitic as well, me, you, all of you, all of us, pretty much in this room, can be classed as anti-Semitic. They have not a single trace of Semitic blood in them. They were all from Europe, came there, and the question I was asked, okay, why are you saying that it's holy to you? It is our land. I said, no. The land belongs to the God, the one God which you believe in, I believe in, and my fellow Christians as well. So this land is holiest to all of the Abrahamic faiths. And to diffuse the situation, I use the term to him, listen, within my own community, my own family, sometimes I don't get on with my friends, my cousins, first cousins, second cousins. Similarly, sorry to say, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, we all are cousins. Shalom.
I mean, the reality is, if you look back at the DNA studies that have come out over the last few years, it is absolutely clear that Palestinian people and many Jewish people had the similar source of DNA. Now, I'm no scientist. I did very badly at school in all of those sort of subjects. But from what I can read of the articles, it seems pretty conclusive. And, you know, my sort of approach, having grown up in a country like South Africa, which was so badly divided, because the political system imposed those divisions on us, was to look for what we have in common. Now, you know, the reality is, there are going to be lots of people who are Jewish, who are Muslim, who are Christian, who are Hindu, who are Sikh, who are Buddhist, people of no faith, etc., who we really like, who we really don't like, who say stupid things, who do stupid things. It has nothing to do with our identity that determines that. That's the most important thing. So in the same way, in the language that you use, which is incredibly important, the only thing I would say to you is just think about it very clearly. Think about it very carefully. And when words have effectively been taken from us, when phrases have been taken from us, the same thing happened in the South African struggle, where certain liberatory phrases were taken to mean the death of whites or the expelling of all whites from South Africa, when that wasn't the intention at all.
Very Orwellian, isn't it?
You have to reclaim the language, but then you have to explain your understanding of what that language means in the context in which you're using it. And I know it sounds very pedantic, but actually, in a world as crazy as the one in which we live, it's very important. So finally, let me say, when it comes to the two-state, one-state solution, I have my own personal view. But more important than that, it wasn't for Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan, who thought that Nelson Mandela was a terrorist, by the way, to decide what South Africa should or shouldn't be. they came up with all these bizarre ideas, like a consociational state. Now, if they actually knew what that meant, I'd be hell of a surprised. I mean, Ronald Reagan was not the sharpest tool in the box, okay? Somebody just gave him this word, probably gave it to him to spell phonetically. He was a very good actor, much like Tony Blair. He read it out very well. It was some sort of idea where basically white people could maintain a majority. So voting would be along the lines of education and income. And because we'd had 350 years of people who weren't white getting lesser educations and not being allowed to occupy all sorts of positions in the economy, it was a very useful way to retain racial domination. But it wasn't for any of those